Okay, so pause for a second, because this is one of those moments where, if you blink, you miss how big the shift actually is. Mark Carney hasn't even finished settling into his role on the global stage, and he's already doing something no Canadian leader has pulled off in years. He's heading to China on a full state visit. Not a fly-in, fly-out. Not a multilateral conference where everyone gets 5 minutes and a handshake. This is a direct invitation from President Xi Jinping himself, and that detail alone changes how this entire move should be read. Canada-China relations haven't just been tense. They've been functionally frozen. Years of distrust, diplomatic standoffs, trade retaliation, and a deep sense on both sides that the relationship had become more liability than opportunity. And yet, suddenly, Beijing is rolling out one of the highest
So it's a pretty high stakes visit. We're not sure what outcomes are going to come from it, but the fact of the visit itself and getting an invite from President Xi Jinping is pretty huge for Canada. So Mark Carney is trying to recalibrate the relationship. It's not really a reset. It's more about trying to put out the terms of where are we going to focus, what are we going to hive off entirely.
diplomatic gestures it can offer. That doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen out of politeness. It happens when leverage is being reassessed. And here's where things get interesting, because this visit isn't really about China in isolation. It's about Donald Trump. More specifically, it's about what Trump has done to the global order in a very short amount of time, and how countries like Canada are quietly but decisively adapting. Timing matters in geopolitics more than almost anything else. Carney's trip to Beijing comes right on the heels of a high-stakes tour through Europe, where Canada was visibly working to reinforce ties with EU leaders and NATO partners. That tour wasn't ceremonial. It happened against a backdrop of rising anxiety among Western governments about how far unpredictability from Washington could actually go. Over the past months, Trump's rhetoric and actions have sparked intense debate across diplomatic circles. Commentators, analysts, and even allied officials have openly questioned whether long-standing assumptions still hold. The idea that threats are just bluster, that norms will automatically restrain behavior, that borders, sovereignty, and alliances are non-negotiable. From the discussions I've seen, those assumptions are being stress-tested in real time. Some online discussions point to Trump's aggressive posture on trade, his willingness to use tariffs as blunt instruments, and his increasingly casual language around territorial issues as signals that old guardrails may no longer apply. Whether every scenario people speculate about materializes or not almost misses the point. The uncertainty itself is the shockwave, and uncertainty forces action. Carney understands that instinctively. That's why this China visit is such a high-stakes move. Even his own advisors have been careful to frame it not as a reset, but as a recalibration. And that distinction matters. A reset implies forgiveness and trust magically returning. That's not what's happening here. This is about drawing new boundaries, clarifying priorities, and deciding which parts of a damaged relationship can be rebuilt, and which parts stay walled off. If you zoom out, this approach has been the through line of Carney's leadership so far. He's not pivoting away from Europe. He's not abandoning the United States. He's not choosing China over anyone else. He's doing something far less flashy and far more consequential. He's building options. Here's why that matters. A country with one dominant trading partner can be pressured. A country with diversified pathways can't be cornered as easily. That's not ideology. That's leverage math. And it's something Trump himself understands very well, which is precisely why this trip lands the way it does. State visits aren't handed out casually, especially by Beijing. They're hierarchical, deliberate, and deeply strategic. China didn't invite Carney because Canada was desperate. It invited him because Canada has suddenly become more relevant. In a world where relationships are being strained by volatility, a country that signals calm, predictability, and institutional seriousness becomes valuable again. Carney's personal reputation plays a role here too. Like it or not, he's globally respected, financially literate, seen as someone who understands systems, not just slogans. From Beijing's perspective, this is an opportunity to re-engage with a Western leader who isn't posturing for domestic applause, who isn't closing doors just to prove toughness, and who speaks the language of long-term stability. For Canada, the upside is obvious. Years of being boxed in by US-China tensions have limited maneuvering space. Every decision became a test of loyalty. Every disagreement risked retaliation from one side or the other. Reopening even partial diplomatic and economic channels with China expands Canada's room to breathe, and for Trump, whether he admits it or not, it's a warning sign. Most people remember the moment when Canada's relationship with China effectively collapsed. The arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver at the request of the United States triggered a chain reaction that froze everything. China's detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, often referred to as the two Michaels, deepened the crisis and left scars that still haven't fully healed. Those events didn't just poison trust, they made engagement politically radioactive. That's why this moment feels different. Carney isn't pretending that history didn't happen. He's acting because the context around Canada has changed. The urgency now is economic. With U.S. tariffs hitting Canadian industries and supply chains, Ottawa can't afford to have its second-largest trading relationship stuck in deep freeze indefinitely. And this is where the conversation gets sharp. Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was imposed in a period when Ottawa was explicitly aligning its trade posture with Washington under Joe Biden. The goal was harmonization, protecting the North American auto sector, and presenting a united front on industrial policy. That made sense at the time. But that context no longer exists in the same way. Trump's renewed tariff threats and actions against Canadian autos have already inflicted real damage. Manufacturing uncertainty, worker anxiety, supply chain disruptions. From Ottawa's perspective, absorbing that harm while maintaining policies designed to please a U.S. administration that no longer exists looks increasingly unsustainable. So when Carney sits down with Xi Jinping, these tariffs are very likely to be front and center. Not framed as capitulation, but as negotiation. If Canada eases EV tariffs, even partially, and China responds by lifting its retaliatory measures on Canadian agricultural exports like canola, the impact would be immediate. Farmers benefit. Export volumes stabilize. Automakers gain alternatives, and Canada regains bargaining power it lost by being over-concentrated. From a strategic standpoint, that's not weakness, that's resilience. Here's the part most people overlook. China isn't just shopping for volume, it's shopping for reliability. In a global environment shaken by volatility, reliable suppliers become premium assets. Canada's energy sector, agricultural exports, and regulatory frameworks offer something increasingly rare. Predictability. Carney has hinted at this idea before, and it resonates far beyond trade numbers. Canadian oil is seen as stable. Canadian supply chains are regulated. Canadian contracts tend to be honored regardless of political cycles. As instability elsewhere rises, Canada's value doesn't fall, it rises. That dynamic opens another door that's quietly part of this visit. Investment. When Carney visited the UAE, he helped attract billions in capital by emphasizing long-term certainty over short-term theatrics. There's a real possibility that Beijing sees a similar opportunity here. Not just as a buyer, but as a strategic partner in infrastructure and energy. Some commentators have even linked this moment to Canada's internal discussions about expanding pipeline capacity to the West Coast. The idea isn't new, but the geopolitical rationale has shifted. Access to Asian markets, including China, reduces over-reliance on U.S. demand, and with uncertainty swirling around global energy supply, those options suddenly look far more valuable. To put the scale in perspective, China is already Canada's second-largest trading partner. Roughly $118 billion in merchandise trade last year alone, not counting services. That's not marginal, that's foundational. And the growth potential remains enormous if political barriers soften. Zoom out, and the strategy becomes clearer. Europe reinforces Canada's legitimacy. NATO anchors its security. China expands its leverage. Together, these relationships create something Trump has historically struggled to counter. Collective pressure without open confrontation. Carney isn't trying to embarrass Trump. He's not posturing for headlines. He's doing something more effective. He's making threats less useful, because intimidation only works when alternatives don't exist. From my view, this is less about defiance and more about insurance. In a world where trade can be weaponized overnight and alliances feel conditional, countries that survive are the ones with options. And right now, Canada is building more options than it's had in years. That's why this visit matters. That's why it's being watched so closely. And that's why, whether he says it out loud or not, Trump is paying attention. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.